let me summarize a little bit what I learned tonight or this morning. First of all, in what are our weaknesses in the Pacific and Asia, but more or less for Pacific Islands, and what are our potential strengths? And I'd like to show this report from the World Bank in 2009, because basically it stated that there was a 3D problem. And the 3D problem was the following. First, density. Of course, we know that many islands, except Australia and perhaps New Zealand, are very, very small and very, very isolated, low economic density, and that's a major handicap. So that's a weakness. The density, also the economic density in the gravity model that we all know for tourism. Basically, there's the distance and there's the density, which are the two forces at play. And unfortunately, we have a quite large handicap from either density or distance from the rest of the world. We have another one, which is division, but I'm not going to talk about this one. It's about protectionism, higher cost, and so on and so on. But let me stop here. This slide, if I can. Let me, okay. I have a little difficulty now. Okay, stop. All right, perfect. And let me continue and say that what we have seen today is that we have many Pacific islands, small Pacific islands, which are very dependent on tourism. And those economies have suffered the most, obviously, from the COVID crisis, because tourism was affected the most. One exception is, of course, New Zealand and perhaps Australia, in a sense that tourism is perhaps less important for the economy, and they have more, those two countries have a more diversified economy. Is it possible in the future for small islands to be more diversified? Personally, as an economist, I doubt that. But there are other ways, basically, that we transform those 3D handicaps into assets. And I remember Jean-Marc Mosselin stating that handicap can become assets, such as remoteness and distance cannot be attractive, perhaps for some tourists. We may have some slow tourism. We may have some advantages to come here. And I'm thinking also of the Brando, which was very well described by Laurent Darcy. And obviously those kind of niches can represent some potential strengths that we can draw from to rebound and to recover. I was also interested in one of the slides, and the one that from Chris Cocker, and this slide stated that reset, rethink, reset, recover. And it made me think, in which order should we recover fast, but with old habits, as Mary just stated, or should we think first and maybe transform our economies, transform our tourism sector, such that in the long term, they could survive? Because unfortunately, one of those two scenarios, Mary, that you described, is one very pessimistic scenario where the tourism sector will probably suffer so much that it will never recover. So yes, you're right. Maybe we can rethink first, reset it, and then recover. However, let me continue and now look at it from another angle of challenges and solutions for a medium-term recovery. Obviously, we heard of a lot of uncertainties in one of our presentation at the beginning. And those uncertainties, of course, we cannot really control them. Those are uncertainties about the COVID pandemic. So obviously we can protect ourselves from it to a certain extent. There are different strategies, as we have seen yesterday and today. New Zealand, for instance, versus other countries. In particular, New Caledonia and French Polynesia, which have drastically different strategies. And basically, Jean-Marc explained very well the communication strategy to try to induce tourists to wait, but not to abandon the idea of coming back to our wonderful islands. Obviously, those uncertainties, I've heard Chris Roberts saying that we could narrowing the wedge of the futures. How could we do that? Yesterday, I presented a paper in which I showed a little bit the different forecasts from WNTO and so on. And unfortunately, these uncertainties are very wide. How to narrow them, it's really a challenge. And the second point I've heard in the same presentation is about fear of foreigners and perhaps over-tourism. That's very interesting because when you read some articles from UHERO, which is the University of Hawaii Economic Research Organization, very much about tourism, it seems that Hawaii has reached a point where 10 tourists per inhabitant might be too much. And from what I hear in New Zealand, maybe Chris can tell me if I'm right or wrong, but it seems to me some friends of mine studying tourism have told me that the population is getting a bit also tired of tourism, although the number of tourists per inhabitant is not high. And we hear that also in French Polynesia. Actually, if you are in Tahiti, and some of you are, I invite you tomorrow. We have another third day of seminars in person and also through Zoom, but anyway. And the point is that will be discussed. Do we have over-tourism today, or did we have over-tourism last year in Tahiti? Personally, I don't believe so, but it's not everybody's opinion. So over-tourism is maybe a fear. Is it founded or not? The point is that how can we find a solution to this challenge? And that's where basically maybe PEC has some new ideas that were actually developed a few years ago with the word connectivity. Basically, APEC, the Association of Pacific Economic Cooperation, basically instituted a framework, created a framework in which connectivity was central to the growth of the region. And one of those three pillars of connectivity was people-to-people connectivity. And tourism, obviously, is one of the engine of people-to-people connectivity. So I remember basically Chris Roberts told us about the labor problems in New Zealand and the fact that, well, it was difficult to find basically workers in some industries, but there was a reluctance to bring foreigners, which would be welcome. Obviously, I think working at that issue of fighting fear of foreigners might be one way, obviously, through communication, as we heard with Jean-Marc. Good communication can help, obviously, overcome those fears. The third point I've heard is about climatic change and vulnerabilities. Obviously, there's not much we, small islands, small economies can do about it, except being more resilient. Actually, resiliency was one of the major topics of our seminar last year in Tahiti in January 2020, just before the crisis, we're lucky. And so it's unfortunate that we have to come back to this theme of resiliency. And I appreciate it very much. Christopher Cocker talk about resiliency, prosperity, inclusiveness. Those are three, obviously, goals that we all probably share. The question is how to reach this resiliency. We in French Polynesia and in some other economies, some other Pacific islands have atolls, low-lying islands, which are very vulnerable to the rise of the sea and the ocean. So clearly, many leaders of Pacific islands have tried to go to the UN and to basically warn that we would be the first to suffer. In the Maldives, for instance, they were thinking of perhaps moving the population to another country at one point in time. So can government do something about it? Of course, they have. We have seen that with the COVID crisis, enormous power, financial power to do something about it. But as somebody said, it's not enough. The population has to be convinced also that we must do something about it. And it seems that maybe the COVID crisis was basically an engine for people to rethink their way of living, perhaps, and to become aware that really COVID was one problem, but the next one would be to solve the environmental problems and to avoid the self-destruction of the planet. So the point about it is I appreciated Laurent when you talked about private initiatives, and obviously the Brando is doing a lot about that. I heard also about TOPS, the transformative opportunities for the planet. So all those private initiatives, I think, are quite important. And lastly, I would say, perhaps not as a conclusion, but PEC, the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council, has a role to play, because actually our goal is to gather, like this morning, this evening, whether you're basically people from institutions, governments, also from private businesses, and also finally from academia, like myself. And all of us, we have different points of view. And when we share them, perhaps we can come up with suggestions, like you have all in your presentations, that we can forward to APEC or to other organizations. And that way, basically, we can perhaps help a little bit solve those problems. One last or two more points that I've heard is the word confidence. I heard that quite a lot at the beginning. And it's true that good communication, Jean-Marc, can help a lot bring back confidence. Will that be enough? Obviously not. But I think to avoid the worst scenario that described Mary, this kind of initiative yesterday and today can be quite useful. So now basically it's almost, well, 10 p.m. for me, 10 a.m. for you. We could stop here, or we could engage in the discussion. It's kind of up to you. So can you open your mic and let me know what you think? First of all, of course, I'd like to thank you all very much for taking that time to present some of your views, your analysis on those problems. And now it's up to you if you want to say just one last word or continue in a discussion. It's up to you. Please open your mic and go ahead. What do you think? Jean-Luc?
No, just want to thank you for putting together these two this meeting and seminar. I think that we have received some questions from participants, and maybe our host this morning would like to answer this question and maybe exchange between them before we close the seminar. It's up to you, Vincent.
Okay, that's a very good idea. Let me state the last open question. How does the tourism sector think and to cover the external costs, including social costs when tourists are using the local public goods? How do you measure, excuse me?
We have social costs, and we have also question on over-tourism in Pacific Island. This one question that maybe Chris Coker could answer, because last year in Papeete, we mentioned this question about over-tourism in the Pacific Island and the cost of over-tourism in this island. So maybe Chris would like to answer this question as well.
Chris?
Yeah, thank you, Jean-Luc, and also Vincent. I think the question was on over-tourism in the Pacific Islands.
Yeah, it's the question we raised already last year in Papeete, and some Pacific Island countries mentioned the cost of this other tourism for environment and the cost for local people, and how to, and we have also someone from Peru and someone from Chile mentioning this over-tourism problem, and there were questions about to overcome and to go with over-tourism and how to limit over-tourism. There was some proposal being put forward by the representative from Peru and some from Chile as well. And there was the proposal also of what was made in Tahiti, as I recall.
Yeah, thank you. I think just to give a sort of where we are in terms of the Pacific itself, there is still uneven distribution of tourism. As you probably know, 40% of the tourist arrivals go to Fiji. Mm-hmm. And then the rest of the remaining are shared amongst our other 18 member countries, and probably French Polynesia is after that in this case. So not all of our member countries are benefiting from tourism in this case. However, it is a good thing for us to be aware of, because we've learned of what's happening in the Caribbean, in Hawaii of over-tourism, etc. And that is why we've also developed our Pacific Sustainable Tourism Policy Framework to ensure that we have a balanced approach in terms of tourism, looking at the environment side, the economic side, as well as social cultural in this case. It's to protect our existing assets that we have, and also to ensure that the tourism that we move forward is more sustainable as well as more responsible, and focus more on niche tourism in this case, in the area of high value, low impact in this area in focusing and moving forward. But that's probably just my sort of short answer in terms of what you've raised. And if there's any other further questions on that.
Okay.
I'd like to know the opinion of Chris Roberts about that. Am I wrong or right, assuming that before the crisis, many New Zealanders tended to think that attraction or places become overcrowded?
We were starting to hear that, and obviously on a different scale than what we were hearing out of places like Europe, out of Venice or Barcelona or other places where there was largely an urban issue with overcrowding in urban areas and just sheer volumes of people. The concerns here in New Zealand were about our natural attractions, Milford Sound, the Tongariro Alpine Crossing, other natural places where numbers were higher and still not on a level seen in some of those overseas places, but at a level that New Zealanders were starting to feel uncomfortable with. And that may also apply to some of the Pacific Islands if the success of tourism was getting to a point where people, the local population, were just feeling uncomfortable with congestion, with the volume, that the local infrastructure may not be coping with that, and the local controls or regulations or processes weren't in place to manage that congestion. So while we often were defensive, saying, look, over-tourism does not really exist in New Zealand compared to what we are seeing in places, the Great Wall of China, millions of people quite literally there on Chinese New Year, scenes around Venice with all the cruise boats coming in. But the reality was New Zealanders were starting to feel that we had too many people coming to some places at some times of the year. And because our borders have been closed, they have rediscovered their country. Pacific Islands also have had their borders closed, and the locals will have rediscovered their islands. Now, there may be a difference because here in New Zealand, it's quite mixed. Those small towns that were very highly dependent on international visitors can't wait for the borders to reopen because their towns are quite literally dying. And they understand that their lifeblood is tourism. In the cities and other parts of New Zealand, which are less tourism focused, that many people there think, well, we don't really need tourism back. We're doing okay without it. Why would we need to have it return? And it takes a while for the impact of that loss to affect them. It isn't until their favorite cafe closes because there's not enough people coming to it anymore, or the service station, the petrol station closes because there are not enough visitors coming through town to keep the petrol pumps still going. So it takes a while for people to realize how important tourism is to their local, to their personal well-being. I think that's what we've seen here in New Zealand, that people who are not directly connected into tourism are the ones saying, oh, do we really need it at all?
Thank you very much, Chris. That makes me think of perhaps one last question, which basically embodies all of them. Mary told us that we had two scenarios, one positive, optimistic scenario and one very pessimistic scenario. Obviously, we talked a little bit about over-tourism tonight, but tourism has gone down 74% around the world, basically. So this problem has almost disappeared, at least for now. Should we rethink first the new normal in the tourism industry before it's too late, before tourism comes back and before we go back to the same old habits? Is it sustainable financially speaking? And I'm thinking in particular of French Polynesia, where we have less than 1 tourist per inhabitant all over French Polynesia, but we have, if I'm not mistaken, 14 tourists per inhabitant in Fakarava and about 11 in Bora Bora. So it's very difficult, because if we begin to restrict the number of tourists, which is what I've seen in one of the comments, then it might not be financially viable for the tourism industry. So is there a possibility for small Pacific islands basically to have their tourism sector survive without transforming themselves? Basically, that's the question I'd like to ask each of you. Mark, Jean-Marc, please, what do you think?
If you want. I think we'll go through a period where, as you say, limit the number of tourists has become like not a priority anymore, at least for a couple of years. People would just, I mean, I'm talking about at least French Polynesia, where people are dying to get tourists back. But at the same time, I think all this period made everyone think about, how we should reorganize ourselves once things are back to normal. And it's pretty much up to each government and each island, each mayor also on each island within our islands, to decide what kind of strategy they want to adopt for the future. I must say, as an example for French Polynesia, our Minister of Tourism has decided to work on the next 5-year strategic development plan. And the first thing she did was to open a website accessible to the whole population, who could say exactly what they want, what they don't want, or what they feel, what's the idea, etc. So it was it was an open discussion and open to not only tourist stakeholders and actors, but also to the population. So I think this is a good example of what can be organized, as well as it can be targeted to small islands. I mean, we're talking about the strategy of a country like French Polynesia, but the strategy may be adapted for each different island. I mean, Bora Bora may not have the same strategy as Fakarava and Moorea. So I think if we give the opportunity to the people to express themselves and governments to take into consideration the population, things can develop in the right way. And one of the subjects, for example, is restricting the size of cruise ship coming to our islands, because as we know, we can have one of those, a huge ship coming into a small island where there is only 300 inhabitants, with a ship which is 3,000 or 4,000 passengers, and so obviously the thinking behind it, to authorize such a ship in our island would be different whether you are on a small island or if you are in Tahiti. So I think there's not one solution. It has to be adapted for each of our islands.
Thank you. Laurent, can you give us your point of view as a business person in terms of all your hotels? Unfortunately, you had to close one hotels in Moorea, but do you think you're gonna restructure a little bit your business?
Well, I think, yeah, what we did in Moorea, I think we did that part of, let's say, restructuring, redimensioning, trimming, whatever was needed at some point. I think for our destination, there's no over tourism, definitely. And, I've been involved in the tourism since '87. That's a long time. And we have kind of a stagnation of our numbers of visitors. We're not, it's like there's a kind of a natural regulation of private actors and also the authorities to keep that balance, and also the pressure of the population, the inhabitants of each island. And so I think there's always a natural balance, and which makes our tourism sustainable. Obviously, our isolations, your small size, small islands, small communities, plus some constraints, limitations, regulations for private operators like hotels. You know, we have the built-in codes, a lot of need to do our own infrastructure when there's not any in the small islands, so forth. So we can. It's like we're not, we won't see over tourism in French Polynesia, for instance. Jean-Marc was right, actually, to point out the exception of the cruise ships. That we've seen a lot of bigger cruise ships, even if they are smaller than most of the Caribbean, but we've seen that, and we've seen some impact. So I think there's no big challenge for that. The big challenge for us is to keep moving towards sustainability, to be more active and have maybe a more a stronger orientation, a stronger policy from Tahiti Tourism, Ministry of Tourism, whoever, for most of the actors. But I think we paved the way. We've showed that direction, and I think we really need to capitalize and emphasize that trend. This is we've said it's in. We have the same conclusion for all markets, and there's a need for that. And our islands are really that's our future. That's our USP, whatever, that's where we're strong, and that's what we are loved for. That's why people are going to our South Pacific islands. So we really need to keep moving in that direction. So we want to we really want to keep moving this way. Sustainability. There is no over tourism. I'm not worried about that, but we want the business back. And as I said, as Jean-Marc said, that's the priority, and that's what I said earlier.
Well, I think anybody, Chris? Yeah. What about the other Pacific island? What do you think? What are their positions?
No, I think I do support what Jean-Marc is saying as well, because I think the key to setting the maximum numbers comes down to engagement of the stakeholders, and particularly with the respective countries. And it's up to the countries, because that will also, they're the ones who are actually going to develop their own national strategies in this case. So I think it's the engagement of the stakeholders, and also the awareness, increasing their awareness of what sustainable tourism is all about in our respective, particularly from SPTO's point of view of 20 Pacific member countries. But they are the ones who should be deciding who and the number that they should be accepting into to their country or to their tourism sites. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Anybody else before we close this session? Jean-Luc, do you want to say something? No. Sorry, Chris, please.
Vincent, I was just going to comment on what we've seen here in the last few weeks, the travel bubble opening with the Cook Islands. And New Zealanders are jumping on their computers and going to their travel agents and booking trips to the Cook Islands. And from the suggestions are that numbers are going to be higher than they were in 2019. So the wave of tourism is going to hit the Cook Islands from New Zealand, which is great for their economy. But it does show that if we are going to talk about a new way of doing tourism, about doing it differently, we have to act very, very quickly, because otherwise tourism is just going to happen again. It is happening again in the Cook Islands and nothing has changed. So opportunities like this, discussions like this have to lead to actions and change. Otherwise tourism will just resume with all its old features, all its old characteristics, good and bad. Talking is great. We've actually got to, if we want change, we actually have to make change quickly.
Well, thank you very much. I think it's a very nice conclusion. And actually, I'd like to invite you to discuss and take actions next year when we'll organize in Tahiti another seminar. And I hope you'll be able to come here in person during a week long. Yesterday, somebody proposed a month long. I say, okay, stay a week at the university and enjoy the islands for another month after that. But the point is that in June 2022, we really intend to have a week-long series of webinars, seminars, I'm sorry. And I hope you can all come. Jean-Luc, do you want to say a few words in conclusions, perhaps?
Well, no, I leave you to conclude. I'm quite happy of this today's seminar because we have a very good exchange, and I want to thank you, but I want also to thank Eduardo Pedrosa, who is the Secretary General of PCC. PCC, Eduardo and his team has been very helpful to put together this seminar. And I think that from this seminar, the PCC will be likely to make proposal to the PEC economies with regard to tourism, because we have specifically talked about the Pacific Island, but some inland countries as Thailand, for instance, in the PEC economies are badly suffering also for very low tourism, as well as Chile and Peru for the time being. And I think that some recommendations were put forward this morning and yesterday will be very helpful to help these PEC economies to recover and provide with a more sustainable tourism for the years to come, and will be open to tourism shortly to benefit from what tourism is bringing to these countries. So
thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jean-Luc. One last technical details. If you wish, could you send me your presentation as PDF files, for instance, so we can share it within basically the panelists? Yesterday I got them all and I can put them on the cloud, and only some of us would have access to that. If you don't mind, it's up to you. Thank you again for all coming and sharing with us your points of view, your analysis, and hopefully that will help other decision makers, stakeholders, make better informed decision. And I look forward to seeing all of you again next year in June 2022, or perhaps sooner, at least in Tahiti. Thank you very much. Thank you, Eduardo. Thank you, Jean-Luc. Thank you, Chris, Maury, and Laura, and Jean-Luc. And see you very soon. Have a good day. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, Vincent. See you
Merci,
next
Vincent.
year.
Bye.
Thank you again.